sure how much introduction is necessary. He's the rare scientist who turned the tools of his trade toward looking at humans, and the result was the population bomb, which made a heck of a splash. And folks are still talking about it, and in fact we're going to talk about it today. The title of his talk is Population Still the Elephant in the Room. Of course, you also know Paul as one of the co-founders of the field of coevolution, and he's doing an exciting new project looking at man and MAHB. I'll let you.
Am I on?
Are you using video?
No, I'm not. No.
Thank you so much.
Peter Raven said that I had to say something about plants talking to this group. And so I have to tell you a really important story. I was walking back from the faculty club one day with David Ackerley, a Berkeley faculty member, and Gretchen Daly, one of my close colleagues at Stanford. And David said that he had been put on a committee to find a more scientific name for the American Journal of Botany. And Gretchen said instantly, what about the American Journal of Bird Perches and Butterfly Food? He sent it to the committee, but for some reason they didn't adopt it. But I do want to say, since I've only got 2 hours, I want to say a couple of things at the start to be sure that you remember them. And one is, if you're interested in California native plants, many of them have small populations. And a piece of work was done at Jasper Ridge, which hopefully you all know about. It's our experimental area at Stanford, which has not gotten the PR that it should. It's been out for a number of years now. It's by Richard Hobbs from Australia and Hal Mooney, one of my close colleagues. What they showed was that the rare plants, so they looked at the flora of Jasper Ridge over something like 20 years, and they found out that under certain circumstances, the rare plants suddenly became the dominant plants and controlled the nutrient cycling and so on and so forth. So when you're trying to make an argument, if you have to make one, but when you look at the idiots in Congress, you know you've got to make arguments, is that a little plant that they say, who gives a damn, it only occurs in this little one place and so on and so forth. When you're changing the entire environment of the planet, those little plants, those small populations may actually turn out to be absolutely critical later on. I mean, we could have avoided all this environmental mess if one small population had been wiped out back. Right, you all thought of which population. Good, I don't have to explain that. Also, just going back to the past talk, being elderly gives you a certain look at, by the way, I'm going to set the bezel on my watch so I don't run off over the 2 hours. Ann and I, last night, watched The Imitation Game. How many of you have seen it? It's well worth seeing in many dimensions. But one of the really nice things is looking at computer technology at a time when I was aware of it and what it was doing and so on and what was needed to be done. And things have changed a little bit since the original so-called Turing machine. The movie is a little bit funny about some of the technical aspects. But when I went to Stanford, I joined the faculty at Stanford in 1959. There were no Xerox machines. There were no tape recorders. I had worked on a computer when I was a graduate student at IBM 650. And it was the greatest computer, as far as I'm concerned, that I've ever worked with, because working with it made you feel like a scientist. You probably don't know what a 650 looked like, but it had biquinary indicators over the front of it. It had about the power of a credit card computer now, but you could stand in front of it and watch these lights flash, and you could wear a white coat and really feel scientific. Things have changed. But I point out to you that on my belt, I have about 200 pounds of books. That is field guides to the birds of almost every place in the world, complete with their songs if I want to call them in. So for all of us, there are a lot of things that technology has done that we can use. Sadly, in most cases, we're not using them for the things we ought to be using them for. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time is basically what's happening to the planet and what's going to happen to us as part of it, and I'm only going to focus on one part of it. I have an ongoing debate with Jim Brown. Some of you know Jim, Academy member. He's the best, I think, the leading biogeographer in the world. And he's gotten really after Ann and me because we said some time ago that we thought the chances of civilization avoiding a collapse was about 10%. And he called me up and he said, "Are you out of your mind? How can you say something like that?" He says, "It's at the absolute most 1%. And I have to say that as I was watching last night the commentary following the announcement of the hottest year, particularly from some wonderful Congress people who were involved in coal in Wyoming, you know, I'm beginning to think that Jim not only was right, but he may be a little bit too optimistic. Hopefully you all know, and you'll find out, I think, in the next talk, if you don't know, that our problems are all a function primarily of the way consumption is run in an ever-growing economy. And the amount of consumption, of course, is a product between how many people there are, how much each one consumes individually, and what kind of technologies we use to service the consumption, the so-called IPAC equation. And people pay a lot of attention to the technologies we use. When you're looking at the climate situation, everybody has a plan for solving it. We are going to sequester the CO2 coming out of coal plants. We're going to grow more forests. We're going to do this, that, and the other thing. People are aware of technological solutions. What they are not aware of, and what is not brought forward, is no matter how much of that crap you do, and it's important to do those things, if you keep the population growing, you're doomed anyway. In other words, it's just insane to think that the population of human beings and the economy can be kept growing forever. As many people have pointed out, going all the way back to one famous economist who said, anybody who thinks you can have perpetual growth on a finite planet is either an idiot or an economist. And often those two go together very nicely. I asked for gin. Okay, so New York Times and the Washington Post both covered the climate news. Not one of them mentioned the population issue. We got to remember that 35% roughly, and it depends on how you do the numbers, of the greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere from our agricultural activities. Guess what? There is a connection between our agricultural activities and the size of our population. Now, if you say that in front of some people, like Naomi Klein has discovered the environment. She hasn't discovered any of the literature. She hasn't discovered what the situation really is, but she has had the gall to say population isn't a factor in the climate change situation. Now, she presumably has an IQ of over 50, I think, and yet she doesn't know that A, the more people you have, the more food you have to have. B, the food, she would point out, is terribly distributed. That is, a lot of people are hungry today. If we divided the food up equally according to our basal metabolism, we could feed everybody on the planet. But what she misses is we don't divide the food up that way. Why don't we? Well, there's a social situation that we're facing. For some reason, we don't have governments or people that want to divide the food up equally. One of the reasons we don't is, guess what? Population growth. For instance, everybody in this, actually, almost everybody in this room has had their ability to participate in a democracy reduced this year. That's the problem. Some of you may have heard of a gentleman named Madison. Some of you may have read, and by the way, it's really interesting to read the debates between the when the Constitution was being discussed. The Federalists had one view, and the Anti-Federalists had another view, and it was a very interesting debate, which is very much like the debate we should be having internationally today and are not having it. That is, how do a diverse group of political entities get together to solve their common problems while still being able to maintain their distinctiveness, their different cultures. That was exactly what the debate was really about when the 13 colonies realized that the Articles of Confederation didn't do the job. They couldn't have a decent foreign policy. It was a problem of trade policy and so on. And so they had a great debate, and the literature is well worth looking at. One of the things that Madison was very concerned with was what's going to happen with your representative government as your population grows. How many people can a single person, a single individual, reasonably represent? And he came up with about 30,000, as I recall. I haven't read it for a long time, but I think 30,000 was his number. Now, each of you who's an American citizen is represented on average by about, as the representative is representing you and roughly 600,000 other people. In other words, one of the things that Naomi misses is if you're going to design a world in which everybody gets a fair shake, you're going to have a different political system from the one we have now. You're also, by the way, going to have a very different economic system. Naomi is absolutely correct there. Unregulated capitalism doesn't do it, can't do it, as we know perfectly well. Now, the numbers, if you look at them, are pretty grim. There was a recent paper in Proceedings of the National Academy pointing out that even if billions of people die off, there is really no way at all that in the year 2100 we can have fewer people on the planet than we have today. In other words, the momentum of population growth is absolutely incredible, even if we have the die-offs a lot of people think are going to be coming along very soon. We're still going to face something over 7 billion people in 2100. The long-term carrying capacity of the planet is a matter of considerable dispute, but most of the numbers that are generated are around 2 billion or fewer, depending on how nervous you want to be about leaving some room for little errors like discovering the ozone hole and things like that, which, by the way, guess what? Ozone depletion is connected to just, guess what? Size of the population. So, the things that we're facing now, I'm just going to run down the worst of them and point out again ad nauseum, because it doesn't seem to get through, that population is concerned with all. Climate change, I've already mentioned. The climate change situation is grim. Get off these damn glasses, which will let me see you, but won't let me see my watch, and then you're in deep trouble if I can't see my watch. A lot of the discussion of climate is focused on sea level rise. Now, sea level rise is really a problem. There's no question about it. But I've come here to Southern California, where it would be a little worse than up all north in Palo Alto. But I almost promise you, except if we're extraordinarily unlucky, this may not be true, but you'll be able to walk away from it. That is, the water's not going to come rushing into the auditorium during my talk, maybe during Peter's talk. The real problem with climate change is what it does to plants and what it does to the relationship of plants to their herbivores. For example, have you heard anywhere on the news that one of the main pest control operations we have is something called the winter? And guess what? As the planet gets warmer and warmer, what are we going to lose in our pest control situation? Some of you may have heard that things called pollinators are important to those plant things that Peter works on. The most recent paper I've seen, I think it was in Science last week, points out that in England, the pollinators are disappearing because of our agricultural operations. And that, of course, means something a great deal to California native plants. Same thing's happening in California, according to my friends who work on that sort of thing. So climate change is going to be mixed with land use change. Climate change is going to be reacting to bringing more and more land under cultivation. And climate change, we're not doing anything about. One of the things you got to watch is the natural human effort to look at good things that can be done, that have been done on a small scale, and say, well, the problem's being solved. We're now getting solar electricity in a lot of Africa. True, it's a good thing. If you look at the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, that's what you gotta watch. In other words, it's like micro investment. Somebody remind me. Microcredit. It's done a great job. Except poverty is really increasing in the world. The UN has screwed around with the data to make it look different because they're not coming up with their 15 development goals, so they're changing the numbers rather than changing what's actually going on. You know, that's a good thing, but it's too damn small. I remember being told by an Indian government official, Ann and I were in India in the 60s, I don't remember when it was, something like 1970, says, you know, last year we shipped 100 million condoms into the field. And I said, well, you know, if they weren't used for flashlight covers, that might have taken care of the night of January 1st. In other words, you can get fascinated by what you're doing. What you want to watch is what the results are. So on climate change, there's lots of things we could do, but unhappily we're not doing it. You keep hearing about carbon sequestration from the coal, you're going to spit the carbon dioxide out of the coal plants. A, it's incredibly expensive. B, there's one plant trying it and it's not making money. And if you listen to Jim Hansen and people like that, Jim said 5 or so years ago, we got maybe a decade to solve the problem, and we're not solving the problem. Another place which affects plants as well is the enormous storm of toxins that are going into our environment. Now, the news has really been grim, as hopefully most of you know. If you don't, by the way, there's a book coming out in March called Our Poisoned Planet by Julian Cribb, which will, particularly if you have to lecture on this stuff, it's got a lot of the information and it's scary as hell. But in the last few years, finally, toxicologists have begun to understand that their entire approach to the problem was dead wrong. When I was in high school, and I bet when a lot of you were in high school, what were you told? You were told that the dose makes the poison. That actually salt, common table salt, is a poison. If you eat a pound of common table salt, you'll die. It's true. But it turns out for a lot of the toxins we're creating, smaller doses are worse than larger doses. That actually it depends on how your cells upregulate and so on. So there's a whole new trend in the Endocrine Society's been pushing it and so on to try and figure out how bad the effects are of the something like 100,000 toxins that are now in your blood. When you go and measure a person's blood and you have better and better ways of measuring the chemical content, you begin to look like the shelf list in an organic chemistry lab. Not only that, we don't know, for the vast majority of them, what the toxicity is to children. Most toxicity tests have been done on adults. And of course, we all know that the most delicate times are fetal and early childhood. Worse than that, although we know there are hideous synergisms from big studies that have been done, smoking and asbestos being the major one, we don't know a thing about the two-way synergisms. And guess what? If you want to do the math, you have to put your computers on it, but you can get the answer in 2 seconds. You know, how many possible synergisms are there between 100,000 toxins? And you're up to an area where you begin to think, is there any possible way of dealing with this problem? And Cribb has some suggestions, but nobody's even talking about it. We're toxifying the whole planet. We're seeing all kinds of symptoms in other animals and in human beings, and I'm sure in plants, although the plants haven't been studied that much because the plants aren't that nervous about it. Plants aren't saying, what's going to happen to my seedling, when I'm exposed to all this crap. So the toxic situation is getting worse and worse, and we're producing more and more and more. Then there's related to all this land use change, again, when you look at the satellite photos and so on, or when you do field work. Almost any time I've gone back anywhere in the world to look at a situation where I had worked before, it's basically destroyed. In other words, any place that's accessible now has been occupied, if you haven't been back there, for 20 years. Very few exceptions to that. And on top of that, there are the discontinuities, which I won't depress you with, but how many people have seen in the news that there is a big literature that talks about the connection of population size to the chance of epidemics, the chance of transference from the animal hosts, and almost all of our epidemic diseases come from animals. They're transferred zoonoses. That the chances of the disease sticking is a function of population size, that the chance of the disease being endemic, for instance, again, a function of population size, the size of a city you have to have before measles can stay in it as a disease, because what happens? More people get measles, they either die or they get immune. And when they're all dead or immune, the disease is gone. So you have to have, the numbers vary, but something on the order of 50 to 500,000 people in an aggregation before you can have measles as a disease of human beings in that area, not discussed. And of course, we are on the verge now. We know from recent work, Turco, Toon, others, that a small nuclear war, that would be between India and Pakistan, would end our civilization as we know it. I can give you the reference to the paper, but you also have to remember, not in the paper, that there are large numbers of people in both India and Pakistan who would love to have that war. You know, the world is coated with nuts, in case it escaped your attention. And so there's another place that one has to be concerned, where population size is an immediate cause of it. A, more nuts, and B, more pressures. And if you don't believe the resource pressures are getting worse and worse, we have harvested the low-hanging fruit almost everywhere. And so we're doing things like exploiting the Canadian tar sands, which are bad climatologically. You don't want to be a plant in British Columbia in lots of areas, believe me. Just look at what mining's doing to large areas of the planet, all being expanded, and so on. Okay, so I presented some things that are little problems. What are we going to do about it? My guess is probably damn little, but where should we be starting? If you look at the population issue, everybody who's looked at it that I know agrees that the first place to start is give women equal rights and opportunities everywhere in the world. They have them nowhere in the world. As Ann and I can testify for you, say Sweden, oh, they're great in Sweden. I know Sweden very well, and the women there are on the short end of the stick just like they are everywhere else. The other thing that everybody agrees should be done is that everybody should have access, every sexually active human being should have access to modern contraception and, when needed, backup abortion. We're not moving in that direction. In the US, most states are moving in the opposite direction. Whether that will be enough or not is an open question. But it's a place where you can start, where every sensible human being will be on your side. There'll be some idiots on the other side, but they're mostly women-hating people who often are heads of large organizations, old men mostly. So that's a start. But how do you design a world governance system that will allow you to deal with these problems? We've seen that the nation state doesn't work. In other words, we have huge problems, just as they had in the colonies, of how they had to organize the United States. We have the problem of how you organize the world to deal with these issues. And although we've had some success with treaties and things like that, it's quite clear that on things like the climate issue, which is a global issue, so far we haven't been able to get there. And it's not like there hasn't been tries. There's been meeting after meeting after meeting, and so on. Still not dealt with. The world population issue, not dealt with. It's dealt with insanely. There's a huge problem, and we're trying to solve this with a mob. That's the Millennium Alliance. I didn't care remember what I gotta tell you the story. Around the turn of the millennium, there was a Millennium Assessment of Ecosystem Assessment, which was saying basically, how are we doing with our life support systems? And the answer was they're being screwed. Well, every person I knew as a scientist in environmental biology already knew that. That was no news. And Ann and I published that what we really needed was a millennium assessment of human behavior. The issue wasn't what is the science like, is how the hell do you change it? And this was picked up by Don Kennedy, and we wrote something in Science and so on, and we did some stuff at Stanford, and we began to try and expand it to look at the whole behavioral issue. But we found out that behavioral scientists wouldn't play. Why wouldn't they? Because they hate the term behavior. Believe it or not. The sociologists, the anthropologists, the political scientists, the philosophers, they don't like the term behavior. I think it all goes back to behaviorism. But anyway, so we changed the title to the Millennial Alliance for Humanity in the Biosphere. But we all wanted to be mobsters, so we kept the MAHB. You can go to the mahb.stanford.edu and join in, because we feel that the best hope of making the dramatic changes that we need to make are to work from the bottom up, to get civil society to get together and work together on these issues rather than fighting each other for funds all the time. When I was on the board of the Audubon Society, I've had a lifetime of failure. One of my biggest failures was they were crazy for recycling. And I said, look, at least if you're going to put all your effort into recycling, I said, besides putting in the literature that recycling can be very bad in some cases and very good in others, it depends on the material, where you are, transport costs, all sorts of things. You should always point out that if you recycle everything that it's sensible to recycle, that the world will end 15 hours and 3 minutes later than it would if you don't, because recycling is not. And then they would say, well, it gets people involved in the environment. I say, yeah, it gets them involved in pushing their recycling down the driveway past their 4 Hummers in the garage. Yeah, never mind. And of course, you gotta do something at the top too, so they can interdigitate and work together. I don't think it's going to work, frankly, but we're working like hell at it. And it's something that everybody can get into, writing blogs. We don't have any blogs, for instance, on preservation of California native plants, but we could. All sorts of stuff. You just get in. This society ought to be part of the mob, not working against other environmental societies to try and get them. We don't have any money. We don't compete for money, but that's what we're trying to do. And my fingers are crossed, and my 2 hours are up. And I got about 3 minutes for questions. Thank you very much. I'll pass the 3 minutes. What? Somebody going to? Yeah, over there.
What if we were to get money out of our political system? Do you think that would make a difference?
There's a chill in the audience. The first thing I always say, except today, if I remember, is the first thing is to get the money out of the political system. No question about it. If you think you're going to convert industry to helping, you're wrong. Because industry, the people running industry have to keep increasing their profits. And and there are some excellent people in industry who care a lot, who are trying to do things. Like me, they're all failing. It's all gone the wrong direction. You'll know there's a change in the basic direction when no politician, or when some politicians start saying, growth is the disease, it's not the cure. Perpetual growth is the creed of the cancer cell. We cannot keep growing. I've been working very hard for 30 years with economists. I hope we're going to have a meeting again this next year of the Bayer Institute on the issue of what does a non-growth economy look like? How do you define growth? That's not a trivial question. And what we do know is that the current form of growth, as measured by GDP or most of the substitute measures that have been proposed and are not used, just can't continue. There's no way. The idea, for instance, they'll tell you that, oh, we'll all become service industry, so we'll just keep the population growing and we'll all spend our time serving each other hamburgers in McDonald's. It just doesn't work. So getting the money out of politics, fighting, I keep forgetting things like the Supreme Court. decision. By the way, if we get somebody like Romney as the next president, then the big thing's going to be the Supreme Court. We're going to lose anyway, but you're not going to have a chance with the present Constitution, the Supreme Court, and the direction it's going to go. Citizens United was what I was trying to remember. And, you know, the issue is, will people ever wake up? And I think the answer is only if you have a sort of movement that really, we've had small signs of it, but don't be fooled by some of it. There's no Arab Spring. That was, you know, the idea that somehow the Middle Eastern countries were all going to become Jeffersonian democracies because they had cell phones and so on. People just don't do the numbers or look closely at those situations. We have, when you look at the Middle Eastern situation, yeah, oh, we're going to have these ways of keeping the Iranians from getting nuclear weapons. Israelis already have nuclear weapons. The populations in that area are growing like skyrockets, including the one in Israel, where the behavior of the country is insane. They've got about 1 million Arab citizens who they treat like shit. If they treated them better than everybody else, then they'd have 1 million Arabs standing up and saying, you know, move away. Got hideous water problems, huge population growth problems, climate change probably going to make the water problems worse, and then those things aren't even discussed. It's all discussed at the old geopolitical level, which can be important. A lot of these problems that people are concerned with are very important. Housing for the poor, civil rights, giving the police the kind of honor and jobs that they deserve, and, you know, getting them better trained and so, all good. But if you get 5 to 10 degrees Celsius of climate warming, it's not going to make the slightest difference. Same thing with all the huge religious battles. You know, if you believe in supernatural monsters, fine. But if you raise the temperature that much, it's not going to make any difference. And on that happy note,